Hello, this is Dan Ferrisi, Editor-in-Chief with Commercial Integrator, and welcome to AV Plus, the podcast for the commercial AV integration industry. Here we have a very special AV Plus where we reflect on InfoComm 2022. We have three expert guests, all of whom attended the show and all of whom have some strong opinions about where it was a strong show and where it was a little bit of a weaker show and where improvements could be made. David Danto from the IMCCA and Poly, David Maldo from Let's Do Video, and Amala Reddie right here from Commercial Integrator making her AV Plus podcast debut. Let's take it away, and thank you for joining us on AV Plus.
As always, please like and subscribe to our YouTube page, and please subscribe to the AV Plus podcast on Apple and on Spotify.
Well, we're just a few days post InfoComm 2022, and here on AV Plus, we're featuring some expert opinions from those who were there. I'm happy to be joined by David Danto, Director of Emerging Technology, IMCCA, as well as Director of UC Strategy and Research at Poly. Also, David Maldo, Founder and CEO of Let's Do Video, and Amala Reddie, who is Associate Editor of Commercial Integrator and who works with me every day. David, Amala, thank you so much for being on the podcast and joining me.
Pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So let's get right into it because there's a lot to cover coming out of InfoComm 2022. I know from my perspective, it's the hardest I've ever worked a show. There was so much going on, wall-to-wall meetings, morning events, evening events. I'm sure your schedules were just as packed as mine. I think the first thing I want to touch on are all the get-togethers, the networking events, the AV Tweeps community. It just seemed like an incredibly powerful time for members of this industry family to get together, to share hugs, to share thoughts, to just kind of network with each other. Can you share your perspectives? And, everyone can kind of respond in turn about the power of our industry getting together, people spending time with each other, not on a screen, but face-to-face.
Well, I'll start. I think. Sorry, but I mean, that's a big reason why I'm there, and so much comes out of it. I don't think this would be happening. What we're doing right now is because of InfoComm, and I'm doing a lot of other things like this because of InfoComm. And it's just, I talk to people on video all the time, but it just seems like there's some conversations that don't happen until you're in person. So it's definitely not just a nice thing; it's an important thing. It's a valuable thing, and I really appreciated it.
Yeah, and it's also a fact that, the community that has built up in, the AV and the collaboration space online, definitely during the pandemic, but even pandemic aside, the community is almost even bigger than the show. The InfoComm show has education, plus or minus how good the sessions are. They have exhibitors, plus or minus what gear they have to show. But it's also just this fodder, this base for the community to get back together with each other, and everybody loved it. I mean, people had different levels of experiences. Some were celebrating, some were mourning the loss of some of the people in our industry. Some were partying throughout the night, if I can believe the pictures. But the idea that we've now built a real community, and people feel that sense of community, which comes around the show, is probably something very special.
Yeah, for me, because I'm very new to InfoComm, it was my very first InfoComm, and I joined last year during InfoComm 2021. For me, it's almost full circle. For me, it was seeing all these people on Twitter that I've been reading about, hearing about, speaking to, for certain interviews, but actually meeting them in person, and everybody was so nice. And when I picked up my press badge, it was Joey Lloyd who was there. And the first thing is, after she read my name, because I was wearing a mask, she just reached out for a hug. No questions asked. She just reached out for a hug. And, that made me feel more at ease because, it was such a big hall and so many people and exhibits set up. A little bit intimidating, but once that hug came through, I knew I was in good hands.
And I agree with you, David, about the conversation, David Maldo, I should say. I agree with you about the conversations that only are had in person. And I see it myself, as a remote worker. We talk a lot about work from home and things like that on the AV Plus podcast and the pages of Commercial Integrator and just among us. And there are conversations that I only have on the rare occasions that I go into the office. There are conversations I only have on the rare occasion I'm on the trade show. My colleague, Zach Camo, his wife was running in the Boston Marathon, I don't think we would have talked about that on Teams or on a video call. But when I'm physically face to face with someone, we're talking about the Boston Marathon, et cetera. So there's real power, I think, even if it's once a year, twice a year, whatever it is, in AV tweeps coming together. And we have such a built out Twitter community, such a built out online community, whether it's AV in the AM or just daily interactions. But it's really kind of the crown jewel of those relationships to see each other, get to know each other's wives and husbands and families, and just really commune as an in-person network.
Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about the logistics. So, this is something that was talked about quite a lot on the show floor, the West Hall and the North Hall, and whether that worked. And my understanding is, obviously the LVCC, there's construction going on, there's expansion going on, and now may just be a time where we need to compromise and accept imperfections logistically. I found it very difficult for someone like me, and like Amala for that matter, who had probably 45 to 50 meetings over the course of the show, pretty much every half hour, every day. It makes it quite difficult, for me at least, to say, well, Monday is going to be my Wednesday is going to be my North Hall day. Thursday is going to be my West Hall day. So if someone in the North needs to meet with me, well, it has to be Wednesday. People can't necessarily work like that. And it's very difficult to traverse the halls when you have 30-minute meetings. You're going to have a 10-minute meeting and then a 15-minute walk. What were your thoughts about the logistics?
Yeah, I have to agree with you. And you know what? Yeah, I take quite a bit of heat on social media for a lot of this stuff, and I don't care. I have broad shoulders. But we have to call out the good things when they're good and the bad things when they're bad. This layout didn't work. The idea that you have to be in one hall one day, another hall the other day, or if you've got a meeting from one end of one hall to the other end of the other hall, that you've got to accept a 30-minute walk between the two, or going outside in uncovered areas, and jumping on one of the, the Boring Company Teslas in the tube. It's just not a layout that works. We should have been in adjacent halls in North and Central there. I understand, speaking to some people who are in the know in the space, that the LVCC is pushing people into the new West Hall because it's new and it's less expensive to operate and it's the shiny thing. We shouldn't have accepted this. And what I just heard today from some people that I'm aware of is that obviously the show moves back and forth between Orlando and Vegas. So next year is in Orlando. The following year in Vegas, the North Hall is not available. So they're actually contemplating North Hall, Central Hall, which would be insane. I think that our organization needs to stand up and say, look, if you can't give us either one hall big enough or adjacent halls, there are plenty of other places in Las Vegas to go to. There's the Venetian Conference Center. There are conference centers at Caesars. There's conference centers at Mandalay Bay, huge ones. If the LVCC can't meet the needs, we have to stand up and say, you're not meeting the needs. Let's get up a better plan. Because everybody who is involved in this has to admit that this was either a minor inconvenience or a major inconvenience. It just wasn't good.
David Maldo, Amala, what are your thoughts? Do you agree with David?
Yeah, I mean, it's something. I have a main character syndrome, so it's all about me. And since it wasn't a problem for me, it's not a problem. But it wasn't a problem for me, but I see it was a problem for other people. The reason it wasn't a problem for me is because I only cover the West Wing. I only cover the West Conference Hall. Everyone I talk to, all of my sponsors, all of my potential sponsors, everyone I like writing about. So, when I was in work mode, I just stayed in the West Wing. And then when I wanted to break and kind of just go to a trade show and look around, I went to the North Hall, and it was amazing. I loved the North Hall. And partially because when I was in the North Hall, I wasn't in work mode. I was in check it out mode, and there's so many pretty lights and stuff to see. But that's an unusual situation. I think most people, are trying to work the entire time they're there, go from meeting to meeting, and having this going between hall and hall. And I understand if there isn't a hall that's big enough for everyone, you need to do two halls. And if those are the halls that are available, I mean, I've never put on a show anywhere near this big, so it's hard for me to criticize, but I can't. David Danto isn't just being a curmudgeon. He's not the only one saying this. There's a lot of people at the show who are saying, my feet hurt. I don't want to keep walking back and forth, and I'm missing meetings. It was a real problem.
More than just a personal inconvenience, just to briefly for a second, there were unified communication vendors in the North Hall. And they looked at me when I spoke to them on Friday and said, how come no one came to visit us? And it's because everybody was focusing on that space in the West Hall. So, you have to assume that there are going to be vendors that are interested in the space in both halls and set it up in such a way so you can go between them. That's a real disadvantage to somebody that is in one space, but the majority of the vendors are half an hour away.
Absolutely. How about you, Amala? How difficult was this for you to traverse, again, with 40, 45, 50 meetings on your schedule?
Yeah, I just have to blame you, Dan. I'm just kidding. Yeah, but thanks. We set up a very hectic schedule for me. And I think in a way it was good because I got to meet so many different people. And for my first InfoComm, always a good thing. But yes, I'm one of those people who, when my feet hurt, because I was unprepared for the amount of walking. I know I'm on the younger side, but I'm still coming out from the pandemic, and I have been remote my whole life. So for me, that amount of walking was unprecedented. I definitely enjoyed it, but there was a point, certain meetings where I was really cutting it close, and I was worried about making it on time. My strategy was starting my day early, so I was making it to meetings very early, so getting it within the 20-25 minute mark, and then running, basically just speed walking to the West Hall. And I had meetings that were sandwiched, so I had 2 meetings in the West Hall and 1 meeting in the North Hall in between, and that was interesting. And I tried the loop on Thursday, I believe, because my feet had given up, and it just made no sense because it was so hot outside. I was debating, is it better for me to walk all the way in the air-conditioned hall, or is it better for me to sit for 2 minutes in the hot sun? So it was kind of a hard choice, but overall, I definitely enjoyed it. If the distance was a little less, would have been better. I'm also thinking of those with disabilities, if there was no real amenities, resources for them. I mean, I knew there was some using motorized cars, which was great. But there are some who have canes, and maybe a walkway like you have in the airports would have been so much more beneficial, saving time. I was dragging a suitcase on Friday. That also added to the mobility issues. So I think there were a lot of things I could have done better, but overall, it was a great experience, at least for me. I definitely have to hand it to the press office. There was always food over there. If I needed a meal, I knew I had to go there. It just happened to be in the West Hall.
Yeah, I mean, I found it pretty difficult to navigate myself. And, again, with the number of meetings we have, and I wasn't able to really focus on either the West, like you had said, David Maldo, or the North. I was kind of back and forth between both. And I know on Friday I had a meeting at 3:30. I think we were talking about this on the Poly podcast before the show. I was, booked out to 3:30 to 4 o'clock on Friday. And I needed to rush and see one other company in the North Hall. I had been in the West Hall for my 3:30 meeting. I think I got to the North Hall to see my last meeting at 3:58 on Friday afternoon. And I'm amazed that I was able to get there with quote unquote 2 minutes to spare, but it was not easy to traverse that level of distance. And even if you're a New York power walker and a speed walker, it still was at least 10 minutes to get from one to the other, even if you were walking very, very quickly. I was talking to Rachel Archibald at the show, and she was talking about, the central hall as an option. And she said, it's obviously much, much more convenient, but when you go into the bathrooms there, for example, she said it reminds you of being in like a high school bathroom. It's kind of run down and grungy, and the carpets aren't that clean. And obviously the West Hall is shiny and new. But I think for me, at least, I would take convenience over aesthetics.
And we also, as long as we're talking about the West Hall, not to beat a dead horse here, but the layout of the West Hall just didn't work. I mean, if you go in to see somebody and you run in and you hug because you haven't seen them in a while and say, hey, let's go somewhere and have a quick chat, and you go outside and there's no place in that enormous lobby to sit down on a soft bench and have a one-on-one or a one-on-two chat. It doesn't exist, other than the food court, which is probably about a quarter of the size that was needed. So whenever you're in that area, you're overpaying for food and there's no place to sit down. If you're in the North Hall or the Central Hall by the large central corridor, they have benches around the columns. They have seats in some area. You can break away into a corner. There was no corner that you could get to have this one-on-one chat, which is so valuable. And even if you had found a space that you could talk in, you've got this DJ with overloud music in both locations pounding away stuff in the hall. So again, if the beauty of this event is for us to get together once or twice a year and really enjoy each other's company, why are we making it so hard to do that? And these shouldn't be really complicated decisions.
Right. No, I don't disagree at all. I think you're right. So moving on
One
to
quick thing,
oh, sure.
I just want to end with a positive. My favorite thing about the West Hall, the press room is way up on the second floor with a massive window. I've never had such an amazing view of a trade show before. It was gorgeous. I was spending a lot of time. I had meetings in the press room, and of course, seeing my other analysts and friends in the press room. And I'm like, oh, I felt like box seats at the Super Bowl. It was so
Yeah.
the press room at the West Hall.
Oh
Thumbs
yeah,
up.
the press room was amazing, and I like that I could sit over there. That was, I think, how I solved my West Hall seating issue. I used to go to the press room, and I wish I had a great camera because I really wanted to capture that view. It's just like the reflection of my phone was coming on that when I was trying to take a photo of the beautiful, gorgeous view. I was and I committed to memory. I said, and let me just absorb it in memory if I cannot get it on my phone. But yeah, I agree. It was a fantastic view.
Yeah, that is definitely one of the virtues of the West Hall, no doubt about it. We spent so much time talking about the social aspects and talking about logistics and things. I do want to at least briefly touch on technology, things that might have impressed you, might have guided the way for where you think the future is. David, Amala, were there any technologies or any developments that struck you? Was it more evolutionary? Was it more revolutionary? What is your perspective?
Well, I do believe it was more evolutionary than revolutionary, as we've had this year. We've had a number of organizations not have product available to ship or have long waiting times. The most interesting thing on technology that I saw is you couldn't escape the concept of hybrid working. Most of the collaboration vendors, some of the non-collaboration vendors, were embracing this term hybrid. And I had the great opportunity to host events for 60 to 70 end users. And the interesting thing is everybody agrees that hybrid working is the future, and nobody agrees what that means. It's something we all throw around, but we haven't really come up with a definition for. So you definitely saw some new products, certainly from Poly, from some of Poly's competitors. Smaller cameras meant for smaller rooms. We realized the future of the office is going to be different, not so much big stuff. A lot of automation in cameras, AI, and machine learning. Displays certainly getting better. There were some interesting improvements in technology, but I didn't think there was a wow new product at the show that knocked my socks off. David, what about you?
Yeah. Well, one interesting meeting I had was with the IMCCA team. There's some people at IMCCA that put together a report every year on the state of the industry, and it's heavy on math. I mean, it's spreadsheets, it's data, it's numbers, and I try to remember as much as I could. But the one thing that stuck out at me was pre-pandemic, and these numbers aren't right. It's ballpark. I didn't take notes, but pre-pandemic, facilities would spend 3 or 4% of their budget on AV. And post-pandemic, they're planning on spending 30% of their budget on AV because offices are no longer places where you go to do work. If I'm going to work on Excel all day on a spreadsheet, I'm not going to commute an hour to do the Excel at my office computer is not better than the Excel at home. If I have to write an article for 4 hours, the Word on my, I'm going to write at home. The only reason I'm going to the office is for collaboration, for teamwork, for meeting rooms. And there's always going to be, that's what hybrid is. Even if we haven't agreed on it, this part of hybrid we agree is not everyone's going to be at the office ever. So there's always going to be a few people remote. So every room in the office is now a meeting room. So there's got to be cameras everywhere and microphones everywhere and Zoom or Microsoft Teams everywhere. So this is a good time for our industry. Now, in terms of individual announcements, there weren't a lot. And I think that's because we're not back in the InfoComm cycle. I think vendors used to save stuff for InfoComm. Before InfoComm every year, I would get a bunch of NDA briefings. This is what we're going to show at InfoComm. I had none this year. And when I went to InfoComm, what's the new thing? Oh, it's the thing we showed you at the last show, or it's the thing we showed you at our event, or it's the thing we briefed you about. So it was seeing in person things I had already heard of, with a very few exceptions. That being said, there was a lot of things I liked. One thing I'd like to give a shout out. TechSip doesn't get enough love. They're a very cool company. They have a virtual court service offering now, which I need to learn more about. In my previous life, I was an attorney, so I'm very excited about that. I like that. I like taking video instead of video as a product, video as a feature in other products, as a part of something bigger. So that really excited me. And there's always some cool demo stuff. The Crestron thing. I think of it as the new telepresence. They have this room with monitors on all the walls, on cameras on all the walls, like 8 cameras in the room. So everyone in the room has a camera pointed at them. So everyone has a view like we have it now. We talk about meeting equity. Meeting equity is we look great at home. We don't look that good in the meeting rooms anymore. That Crestron demo was awesome, but what's it for the Fortune 5? I mean, it's the new telepresence, but it was very cool. And there were other few cool things like that, but it's not like in the past. Hopefully we'll get back in the cycle, because that's one of the fun things at InfoComm is seeing the new thing. Not so much this year.
Yeah,
So I was just going to say, Amala, obviously with it being your first InfoComm, you don't have a whole lot to look back on and say, oh, I remember what it was like at InfoComm 2016. But what was your impression about the new technologies and whether they were really debuting things that struck you at least as revolutionary?
Well, I'm by no means an expert on all of the technology, but for me, it was more eye-opening to see what I've written about, what I've read about in press releases, a lot of terminology making more sense to me, especially AV over IP. I think for me, that was a buzzword that I kept putting in the press releases since they had them, but there were a lot of exhibits that took the time, vendors taking the time to explain to me how it works. And that made me have my aha moment, kind of realizing, oh, this is how the technology works. So, this is how it's used in applications. There's something about seeing it in person versus reading about it. There's only so much of technical data you can process on a screen, but when you actually get to see it and when these product managers explaining it to you, like, this is how the product works, this is where we use it, and this is how we're approaching it. For me, that was amazing. I kept telling them, like, I'm this overexcited student learning as much as I can. For me, of course, the visuals in the North Hall just blew me away because I've never seen anything like it in my life. I mean, seeing like Samsung's The Wall or O Visuals, huge displays. I have never seen any of that up close. Maybe perhaps in stadiums, but I never acknowledged them because I was not part of the AV industry. And I think once you're in it, you're really in it. You never stop seeing it everywhere. So for me, seeing that up close was revolutionary for me.
Yeah, I mean, I felt the same way at my first InfoComm back in 2005. And much like you, when I was hired with Sound and Communications back then, I had strictly a journalism background, journalism expertise, not an AV expert. And I know you're much the same way. You're a journalism and English expert, not a technology expert, but you go to a show like this and you can't help but learn and just kind of wet sponge it, soak everything up. As far as what I was kind of particularly impressed by, I stopped by the AVISPL booth on the first day, and I was impressed by what they were doing with virtual reality, essentially using it as a tool to get integrators and members of our community into the dialogue more quickly, where rather than showing line drawings and drawings on paper what a room could be, virtualizing a room, putting it in, putting your headset on, being in a 360-degree mock-up of the room you're intending to create. And then you're thinking, well, maybe should the table be oriented this way? Maybe we'll put the screen this way. It's essentially making a room real before it's real. And that puts you in dialogue with architects, can put you in dialogue with designers. It brings us to the table earlier, and it enables us to see what these spaces we're trying to create will look like and will function like before they exist. So that's the way it was framed to me. Essentially, it's a way to get us to the table more quickly and enable us to envision and experience these spaces before they exist. And I thought that was really interesting.
I love stuff like that.
And you guys are now, you've got the drug inside you at this point now. You're never going to be able to just be a participant or a viewer at a movie again. You're now officially an observer. You're going to see the technology and understand what the lighting looks like and understand the displays. When there's something wrong, that's going to stand right out at you. You're going to lose yourself. You're not going to be able to pay attention. So you're welcome to the club. That's what we all do.
Absolutely. So we've been going for over a half hour now. We can continue on, but I just wanted to touch briefly on the end user aspect, because again, having been to these shows, NSCA Systems Integration Expo back in the early aughts, and now InfoComm, this was my 17th in person. I think we've continued to see the empowerment and the rise in stature of end users. For example, HETMA obviously was all over the show. People like Joe Way are treated like, celebrities now on the show floor, whereas 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I'm not sure that an education technology manager would be treated that way. So what is your perspective, especially David and David, since you've been to these shows in the past and seen the difference then to now, your assessment about the rise in power of end users?
Well, it is always about the end users. Any show that I've always been to, when I go to the booths, from the vendor's perspective, I talk to my vendor friends, I say, how was the show for you? The first thing they talk about is how many end users. That's what it's all about. I mean, they never say, oh, it was great. You know, the community is here. I've been talking to the press, talking to us. Oh, and by the way, the end users, the first thing they say is the end user traffic is good. The end user traffic is not so good. And I wasn't expecting it to be good. I thought this was a coming back show. Other shows have been sort of, end users are going to be wait and see. But you know what? The industry's here. We're here. We're talking to press. We're talking to analysts. We're talking to partners. We're talking to other vendors. And it's worth being here just for that. But we didn't make a lot of leads and sales, but that's okay. We're showing the world we're back, and next year we'll have end users. And that's what I thought this was going to be. And wow, was I wrong. On the first day, I was talking to vendors and they were saying, end users are everywhere. We can't keep up. I was talking to a smaller camera. I don't want to get anyone in trouble, so I won't say which, a smaller camera vendor. And they said, we've had 400 leads today, written down leads, 400. And I'm like, how many is that? How many sales? That'll probably be 70 sales. And one sale could be 1,000 cameras. So they were thrilled, and it kept getting better until, well, Friday, of course, is not a lot of end users, but I mean, there were some booths where I wanted to see old friends and I had to stop by 5 or 6 times because I couldn't catch them because I saw they're talking to end users, and I look at the end users tags and it's like, I know, I've heard of that company. That's a big company. If they get this sale, it's going to be a good year for them. I'll see you later. Good luck. So it was a massive end user success.
Do you concur?
Yeah, I would agree absolutely. You know, and in fact, the one thing that the show doesn't capture as effectively as it needs to, and we're talking, some of the small user groups are talking about this from a sense of community, is that sense of community. You know, there's some planned like evening dinners and some planned events that people go to, but not a lot. And not as many as we need. And I've seen a lot of traffic on social media again saying, you were there and how did I not see you? Here's the list of people I didn't see. So I think acknowledging the power of the community, as we were talking about earlier, is something we need to do in terms of the show planning going forward. How do we create space for these networking sessions and these bumping into people to take place? And then how do we translate that into the sharing of ideas? I do it on a small level, as I said, but I think we need to do it on a much larger level of the community. The fact that, you know, that this show is probably less than half the size of a typical InfoComm in terms of attendees, but it had a lot more end users, tells you the power of the community that's taking place around AV.
Just as a point of personal privilege, I'd like to talk a little bit about kind of my top takeaways from the show. And I'm also going to invite you, Amala, to offer that as well, especially as a first timer at InfoComm, as we have talked about during the course of this podcast. I should just let our audience know, Amala and I have not compared our lists in advance. So there may be some duplication, there may be some disagreement, but that's the fun of this. We're just going to see what each of our top takeaways are. My first takeaway is that people needed this show. They needed an opportunity to get together in large scale, in person, to celebrate commercial AV, and even more importantly, to celebrate all of us who populate the commercial AV industry. And in the days after the show, I've literally seen people say that on Twitter. I needed this show. So all the concerns about logistics and other elements notwithstanding, and they're certainly legitimate, I feel like it was a tremendously valuable experience, and people seemed just overjoyed to be together again. This show gave people an avenue to be together, so I commend it, if nothing else, for that, because it gave people an avenue to be together and to commune, and that's so important in our relationship-driven industry. The other thing I'll say is my number 2 item, I found, and this has been a trend for a few years now, that companies have been really focused on solutions, not on specs. When I was in the commercial AV industry as a newbie in 2005, 2006, 2007, I would go to booths, and what we would be talking about would be contrast ratios, we'd be talking about lumen counts, we'd be talking very specifically about items on a spec sheet. During my time at the show, it seemed like companies were focused much more on solutions, on experiences, on the results that the products and the technologies actually would yield. So rather than talking about the numbers per se or the specs, we were talking about the experiences that the technology would facilitate. I think that's welcome. I think that's important. And it certainly struck me during this show as just a continuation of a trend I've seen in recent years. The third thing I'll point to as a takeaway is a continuation of unity, even among competitors and throughout the industry. When I was at a major display manufacturer's booth on the last day of the show, my meeting was very briefly interrupted when another display manufacturer competitor came over just to say hello. And I think that's a nice thing. It's nice to know that although we compete and we compete hard and we work hard, we recognize we're all on the same team insofar as we're on Team Commercial AV, Team AV Tweeps. And I love to see that even though we compete hard, we also respect the fact that we're all working to try to deliver outstanding experiences for integrators, for clients across up and down the channel. We're trying to make sure experiences are achieved through AV technology. And just in terms of unity, I would be remiss not to mention that, our competitor, Launch Code, Megan Dutta, as well as AV Nation, Tim Albright, and Commercial Integrator with me and my team have worked together to celebrate Corey Schaefer's career as she sets out on retirement. Very unusual for media members to come together and collaborate on a tribute, but with Corey retiring and with her being such a legend in the industry, we thought it's time to forget about competitive boundaries. We're going to work together. So I felt that unified spirit at InfoComm. Speaking of display companies, I had mentioned earlier about companies visiting one to the other. I also have to say, as one of my takeaways, that the display companies in our industry continue to dazzle. When I went to my first InfoComm in 2005, I was overwhelmed by the visual eye candy I saw in terms of the screens and the displays. And even now, my 17th in-person InfoComm, I was just as overwhelmed, just as impressed. I went to one major display manufacturer, fine pitch direct view LED. And boy, when that red came on the screen for a fire engine, I felt it was almost a tangible sensation when I saw that amazing image. So even after 17 years, after almost 2 decades of reporting on the industry, the displays in particular still give me that wow factor, still give me those chills. And I love that. I love that I've not lost my enthusiasm and my just excitement to be a part of this industry and report on the technology. For the fifth thing, I'm just going to bring up how amazingly, astoundingly hot it was in Las Vegas. And, with everyone saying how nice ISE was in Barcelona in May, it does lead me to wonder whether it will forever be the wisest move to have InfoComm in June in either very hot Las Vegas or very hot and very humid Orlando. Obviously these contracts are booked far, far in advance, and there are reasons for the show to be in June, and for a long-standing time has been in the June timeframe. But knowing that both of its bi-coastal locations are quite hot at that time of year, and knowing how much people were grousing about the uncomfortableness of going outside, even walking to the monorail, it does make me wonder if one day there will be a consideration to doing what ISE did this year, albeit because of COVID, and moving to May and making it like a destination location, not just for the technology, not just for the people, not just for the parties, but also for the weather. So those are my takeaways. Amala, as I said, we did not compare notes. There may be some duplication here, but I'd love to hear your takeaways as an InfoComm newbie, and then we will wrap up the pod.
So over the top of my head, the 5 takeaways from InfoComm for me would be, first, the warmest welcome I've ever had from the community. I think the AV Tweeps community and overall everybody in the industry was just so welcoming. I think especially for a newcomer who had practically no idea what was going on. Well, some idea, but I think I keep saying again and again, I was this overexcited student and everybody took me under their wing, were not afraid to explain things to me. I had all these questions and I appreciate that they welcomed all the questions. So yeah, I think the first takeaway is really how I felt appreciated and seen in the industry, even though I am just a newbie here. So I definitely enjoyed that. think the second highlight and the main highlight was, of course, the Ericsson Women's Council breakfast. I have written about it. I have talked about improving diversity and inclusion in the AV industry, and I've spoken to such wonderful, wonderful women. And just being a part of that was amazing. I think it was bittersweet because we also discussed Corey Schaefer's retirement, and I met her for the first, and I hope not the last time, but just getting that hug from such a revered person in the industry and knowing that she's had my back and every woman's back in the industry was wonderful. So my second takeaway was just being in that moment with all these powerful women. I really enjoyed that. And I'll just mention on the offside, I think every second person I visited at the booth was a woman, and I'm so happy about that. I remember discussing it with someone that it just brings another sense of solidarity, knowing that, oh, there's another woman here in the industry, and, getting to talk to them about the products, about the solutions, which just blew my mind. Yeah. And coming to that, the third highlight was the interactions. I think my takeaway was I enjoyed the demonstrations, but I enjoyed the interactions with everyone so much more. Everybody was so excited. You can see like all of them have put their heart and soul into the products, or maybe that's just me. I definitely enjoyed learning about each and every product, how it works in the industry, in these applications, how integrators use it. And it's just lovely to see the partnerships too. And everybody is so excited, I think, to be back on, in the halls and stage to be talking about all these lovely things that I've been reading and writing about, but actually seeing them in person was really, really wonderful. And I think maybe another takeaway would be that although the InfoComm app was really, really helpful, especially when I had to find my next booth, I was constantly looking at my phone, and I think I would have bumped into someone had I not been paying attention. I think maybe, like maybe a board of the layout of the plan, or, as you enter the halls, maybe having an actual map. I know having an interactive map on the phone is great, and I think there must have been some old school people who prefer a physical map, or at least certain directions to where the booths are. I remember looking upwards to see the booth signs, and I think there were like specific numbers like 1500, 600, 700, 1500, 2300, like that. But each booth, or maybe that was just me, each booth did not have their booth number right above where, it was easy, you could spot it easily. They were on the floor. So for me, it was really trying to figure out which are the bigger booths and how then using those as landmarks to find my smaller booths. So I think the really good takeaway would be having more signs, especially for those who are hard of hearing and don't actually listen to, the directions. It's nice to have like signs directing you. And it just makes it more easily accessible. So definitely would ask for more sign placements in all the halls. I know there were directions for North Hall and West Hall, but I think within the booth itself, having direction would have been great. And I think I really enjoyed all of my interactions with everybody. I got to meet a lot of wonderful people. I think there was a conversation on Twitter, and I think that's also one of my takeaways is that maybe have like a separate day for socialization entirely, because I think I was so tired by Wednesday and Thursday evenings that by the time I reached my hotel room, I was gone. As much as I wanted to, I couldn't make it for any of the amazing parties, and I definitely had the FOMO. But I think the AV tweet up me was just so wonderful, and I wish that was an entire day. I think we would have all really enjoyed that. Maybe in the middle of the week, just having that respite moment. Others were just running helter-skelter, setting up booth demonstrations, setting up interviews. I think just having that one day in between of just relaxing and connecting, especially, I guess, since most of you have returned to InfoComm after long hiatus. And for me, it's my first InfoComm. So I think that interaction connectivity is really important on both ends. So yeah, I think those are, I hope I did 5 takeaways, but yeah, those are my 5 takeaways.
I think that's a great note to end on. I want to thank you so much, David Danto, David Maldo, Amala, for joining us on this podcast. If you have any closing thoughts about InfoComm 22, I'm happy to hear them. Otherwise, I would just like to thank all of you for your perspective, your wisdom, and your insights, and for having great memories that you've shared with the show, and also some criticisms and some critiques that hopefully organizers take into account. Because we're not here to cheerlead and we're not here to nitpick. We're just trying to do what's best for the industry and our industry community that we all love. We all want the very, very best, not only for InfoComm as a show, which is kind of a US hub for our industry, but also more importantly for the tens of thousands of people who go there. We want them to be well, we want them to be happy, we want them to come next year. So it's all from a good place.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate it. Agree. What's the next show we're all going to be at? Is it CEDIA?
I think it probably will be CEDIA. Yeah, that is my guess, and I can't wait for it.
End of September. We'll see you all there.
Absolutely. And I know IMCCA is doing education content there, so I'm looking forward to checking that out as well. So again, so happy to have been joined by David Danto, Director of Emerging Technology, IMCCA, as well as Director of UC Strategy and Research at Poly, as well as, I should say, Editor of Collaboration Today and Tomorrow, a supplement run by Commercial Integrator and IMCCA in a joint partnership. Yeah, it's not as though you don't keep busy, huh? Not as though you don't keep busy. Also, so happy to have been joined by David Maldo, who is founder and CEO of Let's Do Video, and Amala Reddie, our associate editor right here at Commercial Integrator, making her AV Plus podcast debut. Thank you so much, all of you. Have a great rest of the day.